Hey, Patricia.
Hello, Kim.
How was your weekend?
Oh, I was just resting for the most part, which felt very good. How was yours?
It was fun. My sister-in-law conducts for the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles, YOLA, and the orchestra was performing at Disney Concert Hall, so we went to watch. It was really cool.
Oh, wow, that's so nice.
But we're back with our second part of the Freeze/CAA conversation, this time focusing on you. I want to hear all about it. Should we get into it?
We definitely should. I cannot wait to share.
Amazing.
Welcome to The Art Equation, a podcast from Now Be Here. I'm one of your hosts, Patricia Ortega, and our historian and independent curator.
I'm your other host, Kim Schoenstatt, a contemporary artist and organizer of Now Be Here, a directory of and for women and non-binary artists.
On this podcast, we have a little charla, a little bachipapo about making art and making exhibitions. We invite fellow artists, curators, archivists, and people from different areas of the art world to share their knowledge and their experience.
We are curious about what goes on in the day-to-day of arting. We want to talk shop, get in the weeds about what goes into art shows, talk with the makers and the doers of the art world. Welcome to The Art Equation. Okay, let's start with a basic question for our listeners. What is CAA?
Yeah, so CAA stands for the College Art Association, which was founded in 1911 and is a leading professional organization dedicated to advancing the visual arts and art history and design. And it really serves artists, scholars, curators, educators, and students advocating for artists' rights, academic freedom, and diversity in the arts. And so CAA also runs several editorials like the Art Journal and the CAA Journal, and happens to host an annual conference. In the last few years, it has been hosted in New York City, in Chicago, and this year it was the 113th year, and it was in New York City, where it was also held back in 2019, where I actually was a presenter.
But this year it was a little different. You were more of like an infiltrator reporting for The Art Equation. Was that a different experience?
Yes, it was. I was a lot more relaxed this year and had more time to sit at panels that were of interest to me or where there were friends, colleagues presenting. Because that is the thing. You want to go to listen to so many people, colleagues, professors, artists, but they'll happen at the same time. They have like 10 or more talks happening at the same time. So it's impossible to catch everything.
Oh, so it's kind of more like a convention?
Yeah, exactly. It's actually, it actually takes place at the Hilton in Midtown Manhattan. And it's a 3-level convention center, each one with lots of rooms. So you're just running around, bumping into people.
Okay, but last time was different because you were presenting.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about that?
Yes, I presented a paper that time inspired by fellowship I did in the summer of 2018, I think, at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery with the absolutely incredible Taína Caragol, curator and scholar of Latino and Latinx art. And back then I was thinking about the relationship between certain objects across various collections within the Smithsonian that, although folded into these nationalist collections or national-based collections, they really narrated histories of displacement and migration. So I began calling them diasporic objects. And this is, of course, challenges systems of categorizations and organization, but questions the ways in which objects are collected within a nation-state framework or discourse.
Oh, that's an interesting idea and topic. I mean, even in my studio, I'm confused about how to store certain research materials because they are both, right? Like it's a here and a here and a here, and that can get really complex and confusing. I can only imagine how complex it would be institutionally if you want folks to discover things. So wait, so this year you were more of a casual listener, though.
Yes. And it is very different to go just to listen and be part of the experience. But I feel one can also be more present and more reflexive.
I have so many questions. Thinking about this academic setting, a College of Arts conference, and this dynamic relationship between artists and scholars and curators, do you see that taking place throughout the panels you visited?
Yes. Yes and yes. I will tell you that the panels that had artists presenting their work or engaging in conversation with scholars were actually the most exciting to me, and they made me think about the different approaches to these activities and processes.
Yeah, that's kind of our jam, isn't it?
Exactly. How is the work of the academic scholar and the artist related and different was one of the questions that I was thinking about the whole time. You know, I'm always excited to see, for example, how artists present their work as part of a larger process that either they want to know more about, they're curious about, pursuing or chasing an idea.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting, and I can't wait to get more details on what kinds of things were discussed. Before we do, though, do you have any word or phrase that describes the general vibe or energy of the conference? Just to set the scene a bit.
Oh, gosh. So, yes. So there is my own experience and my own takeaways, and then more of the collective vibe. So I have several words. I was thinking about fear, I was thinking about uncertainty, confusion, and even some escapism, but also mobilizing and activating. You know, it feels like we're living in an overlapping of timelines where it is hard to grasp the present.
Right.
The present moment seems to be something that escapes us.
The conference is planned far in advance, like a year in advance, right?
Yeah, and that's the other thing, exactly. But then on the other hand, the keynote speeches, they call that convocation, had this spirit of urgency. There were speeches delivered aimed at tackling one of the many issues that institutions like CAA are facing right now, right, which are really threats from this administration, which have to do with censorship and what seems to be a clear aim to defund and dissolve organizations and institutions that maintain their independence and are a safe space for thinking critically, for touching on themes of social and racial justice and promoting democratic values and principles.
Interesting. So CAA was really making an attempt to respond to the present moment.
Oh, by all means, yes. They were definitely thinking about it. And I also think they were also trying to give people some hope for the future of the conference. But, I brought these other words like fear and escapism and frustration because it is all very uncertain. There were even people who were not allowed to travel to the conference due to last-minute visa restrictions.
Ouch.
Yeah, so that was the general context going this year, and it turned up some really interesting stuff. So I'm excited to get into some more details and to share clips with you and with our listeners.
Oh, I can't wait. Let's go. So, Patricia, what were some of the favorite things you saw or heard or experienced while at CAA this year?
Oh, there were so many things. One of the highlights was that I had the great honor to meet and talk to Badani, who is an artist born in Argentina and currently living in Canada. She was part of a wonderful panel titled Enchantments, Transmissions, Infections, a Poetics of Knowledge by Latin American women artists. The 4 presentations were absolutely fantastic. They introduced me to contemporary Latin American artists I was not familiar with, like, for example, Alexandra Gelis. And I loved their emphasis on this intuitive knowledge in relation to technology. But it was also about interdisciplinarity as a form of knowledge-based practice that emphasizes contamination and cross-pollination and resists anthropocentric views of nature, which in turn destabilizes power structures and brings in more of traditional and present-time indigenous forms of knowledge. I approached her afterwards, and here is a clip of our conversation. All right, Pat Badani, thank you so much for agreeing to be in conversation with us. It has been such a pleasure to hear you present about your wonderful work at CAA. And I'm interested about your practice, which by definition and by training is interdisciplinary. So I wanted to know what are the most valuable aspects of working interdisciplinarily?
This is something that came naturally to me at a very young age. I remember when I came from Argentina to Peru, from Peru to Canada to study, they didn't know what to do with me during, my undergraduate. This was in the 1970s because I was taking my prints and working through painting on them, and then I would take them through the sculpture room and reactivated them into 3D models and the like. So I was integrating not a discipline, but mediums to each other. But then I also found myself crossing campus and having conversations with people in linguistics or people in sociology or in anthropology, just simply because I was curious about a certain topic and what it might mean in the larger context outside of art. So I think that I developed that modality of working, not thanks to the teaching institution, because they did not have that kind of a framework, but they were generous enough not to flunk me and to finally say, like, okay, Pat, here are the keys to the studio, because I would be there by 6 o'clock in the morning, Saturdays and Sundays including, doing fantastic work, but I wasn't following classroom assignments. I just couldn't. They didn't have a place for me. And so they left me alone, which I think was extremely generous of an arts forum for you to actually go do your thing. And then I moved on and I started practicing, and I went back to university to get my master's degree. And SAIC was the best place to do this because the framework is there. You work across disciplines or across mediums, definitely, and you're encouraged to do this. I had the great pleasure and delight to work with Brazilian Eduardo Cac, whose practice is interdisciplinary because he's constantly doing research in the sciences. And I was already doing cross-disciplinary research in the social sciences. But I think that through his influence and through his mentoring, I found a way of connecting both the hard sciences and the humanities in my research. Reading was always a component of my work, and an interdisciplinary type of reading, maybe starting with literature, but then delving into other aspects of the cultural realm. I lived also for a decade in Paris, and that was an extremely exciting time for me because everything is out. You open the door of your or whatever, and you have cultural.
Yes.
The amount of survey exhibitions, whether they're historical survey, whether it's artists or a key person in history, or same with geography, same with literature, and the references, because when you go to an exhibition site or a museum, there's always a ton of information to absorb and learn. So for me, it was like getting a PhD, but on the streets, so to speak, because it allowed me to have all of this input in one place, in one city. Well, I didn't have to go anywhere else. So I was able to get all of this information and somehow process the information and sort of like distill the information that I needed to produce artworks, because my ultimate aim was always to produce not science, not literature, but art. So all of these, let's say, personal references, I think, have contributed to what was essentially a natural tendency. So whether the things find me or whether I go out and seek them, or perhaps a combination of both, then that is perhaps the cocktail that makes me me.
I love that. And, it's interesting because, in a way, even your artistic searches and your artworks do have that element of wanting to understand the sort of connections, how this organic process unfolds. So you answer a little bit of my next questions, which is about how all of that comes together in the studio, which you actually call a lab, right? How all your artistic objects are configured by this multidisciplinarity, multimedia approach.
It's always with me, in terms of process, a back and forth between theory whether it's art theory or some parallel reading that I'm doing, and the production of the work, the materiality itself, the material. It could be digital objects or it could be organic objects. And it's always based on questions that I have. Curiosity is obviously at the bottom of this, wanting to really understand something that is new to me. Probably that accounts to the fact that I don't have a stylistic definition in my work. I'm just really not interested in style. I'm interested in ideas. And when an idea falls on my lap, or it finds me, or I find it, a set of questions arise. And those questions are answered in all of these different modalities. But I am intrinsically an artist by nature and by training. So somehow all of this needs to be filtered down into an artwork. That's my ultimate aim. There are a lot of fascinating works by scientists who are also artists, and the results are always different. I think of art first, and everything else goes to feed that initial impulse. So that's how it's configured. And in between these two, the readings and the culling for information in all of these different sources and the materiality are what I call mind maps. There's a lot. I think I showed one slide during the CAA presentation. My notebooks are very pictographic. I map things out in a very visual form, adding text. It's my way of distilling the information. So that's sort of already the transition between the textual and the abstract information into a visualization of that ultimate goal, which is the artwork.
I love it. I don't want to take too much of your time. I want to perhaps, just for the sake of the conversation and for our audience to understand, maybe to just give us a brief, if possible, overview of what the Beachy project is about. And then I want to just to see if you have a reflection around, what is the most beneficial aspect of being in this dialogue with art historians and curators in this academic setting of CAA.
Okay, I'll try to be brief.
Yeah.
I love the questions, though. Thank you for that. So about the Beachy project. Beachy exemplifies my way of working. I have an original idea that then just simply mushrooms out with so many questions that no single work can address those. So I break the project into what I call chunks, little pieces, from the word chunking, which is a way that we process information in the brain. And then in one chunk of the Beachy project, I will deal with one specific thing, and it becomes visible in one form. It could be photography, it could be sculpture, it could be installation, it could be video, 3D animation, because the medium is adapted to the kind of questions that I ask. So the Beachy project is made up of already 5 variables or variety of the bichos, and each one of them is incorporated in a different, or manifested or visualized in a different medium. More recently, I've been fascinated just by an excellent tool that seems to bring all of my interests together, which is 3D modeling, because it brings photography as an expanded photography, sculpture as expanded sculpture, video as an expanded form, and all of that comes into an installation. So in a way, I found a medium that seems to bring all of the skills that date back from like 50 years ago. So that's about the Beachy project. It has to do with food networks or food webs and the search to restore these food webs so that we do not starve. As you probably know, all of my work addresses food as the overarching theme or subject or concept and material. And the Beachy is just one of those projects, and it refers to food chains specifically. And then presenting with art historians at CAA, your second question to round it up. Fascinating question, because, I haven't done CAA for very many years. I think the last time I participated in CAA was when I was editor-in-chief of an academic journal. So it made perfect sense to do that. But since I retired and I'm no longer editor-in-chief of a journal, that academic side of things appears during IZEA and other forums in which I present. But CAA was not sort of like my primary going point for representing my work. So I was convinced by these 3 art historians who were presenting this panel, because my work exemplified many of their theories. So I decided to join them as the only artist speaking about her own work, as opposed to the historians who were speaking about somebody else's. So that gave me an advantage and a disadvantage that I thought would be beneficial and useful, which it was. It was fascinating. And the usefulness is there were people like you in the audience. That actually fascinated because you were not the only young scholar who came up to me and was appreciative of my mode of presentation. So that was very encouraging because when you're presenting with art historians, their optic is absolutely different. I present from an experiential point of view. And art historians, what are art historians? They have to go through the facts and then somehow find correspondences. It's less of a speculative and less of a creative. They are speculative and creative. Let's say that they're different source of those contents. So to me, it's just one more way in which interdisciplinarity is a fascinating aspect. I'm always looking for learning situations, and presenting with art historians in the context of CAA was a learning experience, which was really quite fascinating.
I love that. I love the way that she was talking about her work and that her history. It's so fascinating.
Exactly. It was such a rich conversation. It made me think about how scholars have this strict approach that follows a scientific method and is at the heart and center of the North American academic model, this school of pragmatism and pragmatic education. And I mean, scholars and art historians do a lot of work uncovering archives, and this is great work, but sometimes also feels like they're custodians of the archive, like institutional custodians. I was thinking about how there's so much benefit from embracing not exactly non-scientific methods, but more explorative methodologies. I'm always surprised at how in these panels, artists are speakers who present their work and their ideas in a more open-ended and exploratory way.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely not held to the same standards. We're an unreliable narrator, so to speak. Our whole thing is to screw around with ideas and not pay attention to gravity as a way to force a different viewpoint. That's kind of our job. Like, as Baldassare used to point out, his friend said conceptual art is just pointing at stuff.
Yeah. Well, this idea of this open-ended process is not exclusive to art. It's very much connected to the intellectual activity itself. This makes me think, for example, the original meaning of the word essay, which is something my mentor, Juan Quintero, often reminds me of, which is this essay, an activity that is a form of rehearsal, of testing of ideas, right? So following this thread, I just wanted to mention that I went to see this panel titled The Form of the Thing, Word and Image and the Scholar, organized by Thilo Ravenstein. He's at the International Association of Word and Image Studies.
Oh, that sounds interesting.
This was a multi-presenter panel, and the presenters were all from different fields. Some of the examples were Leah Weckert, who was coming from history from the University of Siegen. And she talked about the interweaving of art and scholarly practice in the writings of Saidiya Hartman and Christina Sharpe. Then there was Ruo Jia, who dissected the relationship between fashion and gender in Asian visual culture through her performative scholarly practice, where she investigates this idea of the ornament. Then Pavel Kunysz, who was coming from sociology and anthropology, and his presentation tackled this question of what can poetic evocation contribute to the ethnography of a place's social imaginaries. Lastly, Maria Fernandez Pello, she intertwined anthropology and scientific writing with creative writing in her presentation titled Imagine a Microscopic Worm Crawling Through the Pores of Your Arm.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, wait, I don't really want to imagine that. But, but I love this idea of performative scholarly practice. I don't know, there is something about that. Like, that's pretty great.
Yes, exactly. So my takeaway from this panel was that, it's not very beneficial for any critical thinking to be confined within disciplinary conventions, especially when this comes with the pressure to adhere to certain discourses about certain topics, because that is what validates it, that pre-existing platform legitimizes ideas before they're able to form. So why bother thinking, right? I do think a discipline gives you an expertise and a focus, gives your work rigor. But then even my own journey as an art historian, educator, curator, and even artist adds all these different layers that informs my creative and critical practice.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how that related to your experience? Because you were also a studio art minor, right?
Yes, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot. But I don't know. I really think one never knows where everything starts, and we tend to forget, right? Precisely because who we are and what we do is defined through things on our CVs.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
But I was talking to my friend Jacqueline Loss. Jacqueline is amazing. She's a scholar of Cuban literature and cultural studies. And we started talking about the work of the very well-known Cuban-American artist Ana Mendieta. She's known for her groundbreaking performance artwork, her famous silhouettes, right, where she inserts her body in nature or leaves traces as marks of this motherly energy or force. And so she asked me if I had written about her work. And so that made me think for a second. And then I remember that I did these pieces for one of the sculpture classes I took when I was back at the community college that were a kind of reinterpretation, rethinking of Mendieta's work.
Oh, wait. I want to hear more about that.
They were different than Mendieta's because these were sort of sculptural, performative pieces I did in the desert. So I was using the desert landscape and the materials like bumbleweed and rocks and other found objects, abandoned objects. So everything there seems to evaporate and turn into sand, and all of these elements were part of my work. So in that sense, they were different just because there was a different environment. But I was thinking how this all was very organic, and I was in a way engaged in this intellectual exercise where I was also thinking about my own immigrant experience, my own journey, not through the desert, but definitely through precarity. So for me, it was about this connection with the earth, but unlike Mendieta, who wanted to integrate her body with the earth, I wanted to be contained. I was thinking about being contained and also being in a container. So I created more like architectural containers, thinking about a liminal space of sorts, half boreal, half portal.
Nice.
I don't know.
Wait, so while you were at CAA, you were connecting with artists.
Yes.
And also having these kinds of revelations on your own background and your own thinking and your own origin story, your own portals, so to speak.
Yes.
I think that's so amazing. And what an incredible conference experience. Okay, so just to drop us back into the experience and the people at CAA a little bit, were there artworks exhibited or performed at the conference?
Yes. There was art on display at the conference, and there were also many artists participating in the conference. And actually, there were visits to local galleries and museums. I couldn't go, but I was able to see some of the artworks, performances that were taking place during the conference.
Oh, neat. Tell me more.
You love this one, but it was one of my favorite moments. This was a funny, ironic, and quite provocative performance by artist Sheryl Oring. She has this ongoing project titled I Wish to Say, where she invites participants to dictate messages on postcards expressing their hopes, dreams, and aspirations for the president. So to sort of convey what they think about the collective future of the country. So I was walking by and I saw her sitting on a table with a vintage manual typewriter, looking like a 1950s secretary, transcribing the messages that the person sitting in front of her was dictating. And what I know is that she will then mail the original to the White House while keeping a carbon copy for her own archive. So what I learned is that this performance builds on Oring's Secretary to the People exhibit, which is currently on view at the Free Library of Philadelphia, and showcases the rich history and impact of this project.
That's amazing. Now I want to dive into that project a little bit. I'm just not that familiar with it. So it looks like she was the editor of Advocating Democracy, the I Wish to Say project, from Intellect Books, University of Chicago Press. Oh, that sounds so cool. All right, what else did you see?
There was also this huge screen projecting the video work of 3 contemporary artists, and this was playing during the 4 days of the conference. There were video works by Marina Zurkow and Snow Yunxue. But the one that I got to see every time I walked by the area was this immersive installation called Interlinked by Yunxue Fu. And right there, I found again this image of a weave.
Wait, what do you mean?
So the screen was split into 2. On one side was a grid with horizontal bands divided into squares and rectangles that was playing footage of people walking through the subway, going upstairs, downstairs. And on the other side was a view of modern buildings, just like in Motor City, very similar to New York City. And then the buildings seem to have either projections on them of other places like a beach or a natural landscape, as if they were being sort of recorded from a car driving. So everything was this view of passing by. There was a lot of movement in this video. They looked a little bit like film strips collaged together.
Oh, I love that modulation of space. That sounds so cool.
Yeah. Later, I read the following description about her artworks, which says that they explore connections, isolation, and longing across natural and urban spaces as sites of shared dreams, and that this is meant as an immersive experience through the digital collage technique. I thought that describes it pretty well. But again, this idea of the interlink presented as a geometric pattern, it's very much what I was thinking about last week when we talked about the form of the weave, of the net weaving.
Oh, that's kind of our central metaphor for these events, isn't it? That's so funny.
Allow me to indulge with this image of the weaving for a minute, because of course, part of me being there to experience the event as an emerging scholar, was quite imbued with this reflection, this constant thinking about the relationship between academic work and artistic practices. I found myself listening a lot, actively listening, and started to feel like this sensorial weaving was going on, which brings me back to our conversation during our last episode about, you being at Frieze and this idea of the net weaving instead of networking. So I was wondering, how does this weaving sound like? I hear capture this recording that I want to play for you. Here it is.
I went to grad school. I'm trying to get collaborators. First semester, I stepped out. And I was like, okay, how can I debate this? Like my characters were also the neighborhood.
And that was 2001, right?
So my community shifts work started. And that was about airline in Chicago. That was like the main base. And that's
what I'm trying. My project is.
I was like, how can I get further? How can I get even more? How can I get more to an omnipresent view? Right. So that's where I'm at now, and that's why the grids are so they're basic, but I move with color theory, spiritual vibration, and then color vibrate based on light fast. So think about the history of the area. Actually, that's where my work started from. I'm from South Beach, Chicago, and I looked up the history, and it was like race rights. That my parents knew about, and so when I looked up this history, I was like, okay.
Oh, I love that. I can really tell that there were multiple conversations going on, but the individual conversations were kind of unintelligible. Really a vibrant, dynamic space.
This is why I think it is a good metaphor for net weaving. Because if we take seriously what happens when we net weave, right, what emerges is this overlaying coincidence, transparency, opacity, and singularity of multiple voices, right? You get the echoes and dissonances all at the same time, which then invites for more deep listening. I don't know, to me it's almost like a seduction into the listening that is also a form of abandonment into the senses. I mean, really what a voice is really the product of something that's beyond this communicative and informative function.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you had some really interesting conversations, and it really sparked a lot of ideas, and it occurred quite spontaneously, even capturing these recordings.
Yes, it was all quite unexpected and spontaneous and incredibly stimulating. I did not have a very strict plan, so I was amazed at how it all all sort of came together.
Right.
Even on my last day, when I went to see Melanie's presentation, I found that she too was presenting a project that was mainly about net weaving.
Melanie! Okay, so folks, Melanie Nguyen was our University of Maryland curatorial intern for Now Be Here for 2021 to 22 and is now assistant professor at Rollins College.
Shout out to Melanie.
Yay!
Yes, Melanie was presenting on this panel titled Healing and the Museum Critical Perspectives in 21st Century Art. And her talk was about an exhibition she had curated here at the Art Gallery titled Mother Molds, about the work of Coralina Rodriguez Meyer. But she actually presented alongside Michelle Moncrieffe, who I had the pleasure to work with too. She is a professor here in the Department of English. And Michelle used the exhibition as an entryway to engage in conversation with students about reproductive health justice. And how she described this was quite incredible. She makes this point about how for her students in the medical and public health fields, this engagement with arts brings an aspect, an element to their education that they wouldn't have. Right, coming from a scientific field, this sort of makes them closer, brings them closer to the more profound experiences of the human body and of the female body, right, the reproductive body. So it was incredible. Melanie, in a way, was also net weaving. It was very exciting to see her and Michelle and Coralina representing the Art Gallery and the University of Maryland as a place where art and teaching are intertwined.
Oh, as they should be. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yes. And I want to talk a little bit about Coralina because this was sort of the cherry on top for me. Coralina is an indigenous Latinx Brooklyn-based Quipucamayocs artist. And she's just an amazing artist. And so just listening to her was really the best way to end my CAA journey. Coralina, what can I say? Coralina is a universe. She's much more than an artist. She's a poet and a vessel of knowledge from very different places and traditions. Formally, she works across disciplines, including education, community organizing, moving images, documentary, sculpture, and urban design. She studied painting at MICA and anthropology at Hopkins prior to receiving her architecture BFA at Parsons and MFA in combined media at Hunter College, CUNY. So yes, a lot. On her website, she is described as an artist who, and I quote, builds skyscrapers, mentors queer BIPOC, and teaches at universities and museums. Her citizenship is performed in matriarchal time to survive colonization and assimilation by sharing generations of ancestral heirlooms across geospatial temporal bounds with quinoa, quipus, cumbia, cariño, whispers, and maxims.
Can we back up for a second? Because you used a word I'm not that familiar with. Quipucamayocs?
The Quipucamayocs, yes.
Thank you.
I didn't know what it was either, but it's an indigenous culture from the Andes, the Andean region, that area between Colombia and Peru. And they're known for creating and using quipus.
What are quipus? Sorry, I'm so unknowledgeable.
No, this is so great because they use the quipu. It's like a big weave, basically. It's made of strings and knots all tied together. And they use it to make mathematical calculations, but also as a form of information sharing and information keeping, but also for storytelling.
Yep.
It's so incredible, right, that we go back to this idea of the weave. The Khipu is ancient. It's very ancestral. The word Khipu means knot in the Quechua language. But rather than thinking about the Khipu as a recording-keeping technology, what I think is really remarkable is how it is really much more than that. It is a form of ritual, a way to tie together events and people as if it was a cosmic fabric. This cosmic aspect of this fabric already contains the idea that the weave is not only something that we're making, but is itself an organic structure of support.
Amazing.
So just to wrap things up, being at CAA this year was such a great opportunity to think about this relationship between artistic and scholarly practices and the positive outcome of this cross-pollination and contamination or even permeability of approaches to what are really the same problems, the same objects and ideas. The forms of knowledge that emerge from artistic and academic work are not discrete and isolated, but actually are more generative when they overlap and expand as a result. I think that Coralina really said it best here on this clip.
Our ancestries have long survived millennia, thousands of years of evolution, way before the plantation labor system hit these shores. So I encourage everyone to dance this year, to cook, to be with one another, and to remember those experiences that are multi-sensory and shared. And also to use your spaces and your resources in the most radical ways possible, above, in parallel, and below your structure of power. Thank you.
I love this. I love how she's talking about the multisensory experiences and the plea for using spaces in radical ways.
Yes, exactly. And bringing back this ancestral knowledge. That is how she closed her presentation, with a call for mobilizing resources across all levels. But I love how instead of using a language that is pragmatic and rhetorical, she used an image, a structure that inspires us to understand our place and our power through this poetics and politics of space. And that, of course, comes from her own background in architecture, but also from the vast expansiveness of her political imagination.
Politics of space is a great way to end this conversation, I have to say. I mean, and we're right back to this idea of net weaving, of artists and academics, and the way that the College Art Association brought the communities together to make space for these kinds of conversations. I loved how in that audio weaving clip, you really brought that to the forefront.
You know, I want to think about the relationship between the form and the content, right? And the ideas. And I see that in order to think about that, you have to understand the artistic process, right? How artists are working with materials, and then how we work with our materials, which are the archives, the artworks, oral histories, theories. And so I like to connect those two. And I think this was a great way to understand, well, if we take from one side and contaminate our own methods and systems, then perhaps what we have is something that has a structure, but also it's explorative, it's open-ended, it's not only interdisciplinary, but intermedial.
Yeah, I like that infiltration of ideas, right? The way that artists can infiltrate curators' ideas and the curators can infiltrate the artists' ideas, and how Pat was talking about how her reading and her research really informs the rest of her work. And that is kind of what you've been talking about this whole time with CAA, that CAA, the conference itself, it brought up back to your ideas of when you were making work and how that has informed your direction and flow and curiosity as a curator.
Exactly. Now I think I probably have to identify myself as a multidisciplinary scholar working across fields and life experiences. I don't know. I really felt like talking to Pat and to Coralina brought this up a lot for me. You know, how am I identifying myself as a scholar, as an art historian, and where does the intellectual activity begin?
Yeah.
Right? It's not clean. It's messy. When you start working across, it gets messy, you know?
Yeah.
So,
but that's when it gets interesting. And that's when the metaphor of the weave really comes into play, because it's not just, you know, it's not just one line of thread. That doesn't make anything. That's just a line. It's when you have the multiple threads that are coming together, that weave together, and that's when ideas get interesting, when it's a complex thing. But it also makes it really hard to break down, because when you're having all of these different woven thoughts together, pulling at one thread untangles some other stuff, and sometimes it gets a little messy.
totally.
Should we do some cleanup?
Sure, yes. So you can visit collegeart.org to find more resources and information about the CAA conference. And, well, we also have our thank yous. Thank you to artist Pat Badani for the interview and to Coralina Rodriguez for letting us share her powerful voice. Thank you to the CAA program and organizers. Thank you to Sky Park Tausig, our wonderful producer, to Taras Matla here at the University of Maryland Art Gallery, who has made all of this possible, and to Jonathan Furmansky for this wonderful music that we secretly dance to behind the scenes.
Thank you to our listeners. We'll be back in 2 weeks.
We are The Art Equation. You can find us wherever you listen every other Thursday.
Thanks for being here with us. We'd really love to hear your thoughts. So please subscribe. And if you have a moment to leave a review, it really helps us out. We love the feedback. Talk to you soon here on The Art Equation. The Art Equation is a podcast from Now Be Here with support from the University of Maryland Art Gallery. Now Be Here is a directory and resource created by and for women and non-binary artists. You can find more information at www.nowbehereart.com. Always. We will always indulge you.
Thanks for indulging me.
We are here for your indulgence. We love it.